Hello, and welcome to episode 113 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. This is Jon Denning in Los Angeles.
And this is Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley, California.
My man, it's good to see you again. It's been all of 48 hours.
We just did this 2 days ago, but in that episode, we were talking about the wacky experimental section from Saturday, and today it's the main event from the June 2022 test. It is the full test recap and scale predictions.
Yes, we're on to the entrees from the amuse-bouche, as someone called it earlier. That was pretty good.
It was. And speaking of entrees, what are you drinking?
Speaking of entrees, I am eating a glass of bourbon. So I just got a haircut, and my barber, who's become a buddy, keeps bourbon for me. And today he had a quarter horse Kentucky bourbon. It's the brand. And somebody else beat me to it. So he only had about half a bottle left, and he gave it to me as I left the shop. So, yeah, shout out to Steve Gonzalez. He's a good man here in LA if you need a haircut.
That's pretty cool. Well, I'm drinking, I think, the full counterpoint to any type of bourbon drink or whiskey or anything in that. It's the drink of the summer, John. It's a Dirty Shirley.
You're going to have to elaborate.
It's great. It's a Shirley Temple with vodka in it. It's fantastic.
There you go. So just a Shirley Temple with vodka.
That's exactly what it is, but they call it a Dirty Shirley, and of course there's like a million variations at this point, but my daughter ordered a Shirley Temple at a restaurant recently, and I thought to myself, wait a second, I remember everybody's talking about this, so I ordered one of these, and I was like, this is surprisingly good, and I will be having it soon.
Well, there you go. I'll have to try that once I'm off this bourbon.
You'll never be off the bourbon.
I was going to say a Shirley Temple with whiskey probably would be all right.
You know, it probably would be.
A curly Shirley? What would that be?
Give it a shot next time and see how it goes.
We're pioneers, baby. We're innovators. You picked the song for today, so let's just move right to it.
Yeah, speaking of innovators, song today is Harry Styles, a hit of his from a couple months ago with like millions of YouTube views. It's called As It Was, and I was poking around for songs, and some of the lyrics kind of appealed to me about this song, and it made me think about how LSAC is so much trying to hold on to the way things are. And also it talks a little bit about not being able to be replaced, which I think harmonizes with the theme of that weird experimental section that we saw on Saturday. So he's got a unique style. Hopefully this podcast has a unique style as well, so it all meshes together well. Yep.
I'm an unrepentant Harry Styles fan. In fact, again, I don't apologize for my Harry Styles love.
Why should you? He's a likable fellow.
He is. He's a charmer, old Harry. A little less charming. Let's actually dive into the LSAT world. Talk about some things going on. And I suppose the most immediate thing is that next week there will be makeup exams, or a day of makeup exams, for anyone who ran into technical problems with their June test.
And some people did, so we know that they'll be taking that exam next week. I will make a note to everybody who's listening who might be doing a makeup. The sections that we talk about today will not be on that test. So this isn't going to give you any kind of like hidden advantage. That is by design, both on our part and LSAC's part. So just an FYI there. But once the June test is out of the way, John, what's the next test after that?
Well, yeah, I'll just touch on the next two, in fact, because we get July off, which is a rare thing to be able to say these days, but then we go right into August. The August LSAT is on Friday and Saturday, August 12th and 13th. At this point, you can register for that up until June 30th, really midnight of June 30th. You can register, so there's still some time. You will have your score for the June test before that registration, which we'll touch on in a second. So that's the next one, mid-August. Those scores come out on the last day of August, Wednesday, August the 31st. The next month, the September LSAT, kicks in a little bit earlier. It's September 9th and 10th, also a Friday and Saturday. Registration for that is July 26th. That's the deadline. And you'll get those scores towards the end of September, Wednesday, September 28th.
So 2 more tests, and that's actually the start of 4 months in a row, that's August, right. September, October, and November. Not my favorite way to do 4 LSATs, not month to month, but that's just the way that it is. If you're preparing for any of those tests, one of the things I'd recommend is that we do a series of free seminars, and there's a couple of them coming up here. There's one on June 22nd that is about logic games and templating, really cool webinar. Then there's another one on July 5th. All right, so right after the July 4th holiday, that is on parallel reasoning questions. And then finally, the main event for us, which is on July 7th, the crystal ball for both the August and September LSATs. That is one night only. It'll be free and available to the broad public.
Yes, and then available only to PowerScore students in the recording. And as we're going to touch on a little bit, since we're going to review the June test, I think it's always important to take stock of how well or how poorly we did with our predictions, because we made some for June, but we do recommended problem sets that accompany these crystal balls. Those will be available on our website for students as well.
Yeah, and just as a preview of that, I got a lot of messages relating to the predictions that we made. And usually when that happens, it's a good sign.
I have a backlog that I'm still trying to get through of people who've been writing me about that. So, yeah.
And let's dive into that June 2022 LSAT. And the first thing that's always useful to remember is when scores are coming out. And that is Wednesday, June 29th at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. If you're a retaker next week, you will get your scores at the same time. Mm-hmm. So there's no delay just because you had to retake due to the technical issues.
Yeah, so that's pretty standard stuff. A little less standard, I know you're going to want to touch on this too, is what we saw with the actual test taker volume, the numbers of people who were registered for this test, how those, let's call it, evolved over time. And then the final numbers that I think, are still waiting to confirm, but have a pretty good idea of how things played out in terms of actual test takers.
Yeah, that's always interesting to look at, like the plans that they had. And one of the things we often talk about is the melt that occurs heading into each LSAT. There's kind of like a peak registration that usually occurs on the last day of registration. In fact, the last week of registration for a given LSAT usually is pretty strong in terms of the number of people adding themselves to the roster. But from that point on, the number will start to slowly go down. And there's different reasons for that. Somebody decides that they don't want to go to law school. More likely, they decide they want to take a later test, or there's some kind of conflict, so they move their test date. And then, of course, when you actually go to the days of the LSAT, sometimes people don't show up.
Yeah.
And so even these numbers are still pre-final. But over the kind of like main 3 days that we're talking about here, which is Friday, Saturday, and then Tuesday for international and paper and pencil test takers, the Friday was around, I think, 75 to 8,000 that they were looking at. And by the morning of Friday, they were looking at about 7,500 test takers. They won't get to that number because, again, some people will be like, nope, or they'll have issues, what have you. Saturday was looking at about 8,200. And again, probably the final number will be close to 7,500. And then on Tuesday, you had about 1,000.
Right.
And usually it's not that high, but with the international test takers, the number jumps way up because there's not 1,000 paper and pencil test takers. So you add all that up, you're somewhere into the 16,000s. This morning, the registration total was showing as 17,909. So whatever the final number is, we'll be able to see exactly how much they lost over the weekend itself. But even going back weeks and weeks, this is a big drop. And it's a big drop compared to the prior June.
Yeah.
At least, about a 25% drop over last June's registration numbers. So this continues the trend that we've seen throughout the spring of, so far, the applicant group is smaller. There's not as many people in it. That means if you're applying this fall and putting in applications in, say, September, October, November, and so forth, right now it's looking like you're going to be competing against fewer people. And as an applicant, that's a good thing for you.
Yeah, I don't think anyone listening to this feels that's bad news. It is a little striking on our end, though, to see just quite how severe the attrition was here. Again, to put a tally to your reference to last June, over 23,000 people ended up taking the June 2021 test. I think this one's probably going to have fewer than 17,000 people. So it's about a 6,000 person drop. That's enormous.
That's a lot.
30+%. So we really saw, and this test at one point had over 23,000 people registered for it.
Yeah, it had a huge melt on it. And by the way, John, there are some law school officials who listen to this, so they're not happy about this.
That's true. We're not the only ones kind of scratching our heads here.
Now, whether or not that affects, class sizes or, medians still remains to be seen. The U.S. economy appears to be heading into a recession, probably the world economy. And when that happens, you usually start to see an increase in graduate school applications. So we could have an offsetting factor beginning really right about now that could drive people to start looking at the LSAT and law school throughout the summer and fall. So we'll have to see how these kind of like buffeting winds work together or against each other and see what the final numbers are. But we'll obviously keep on top of that, both with the podcast, our Twitter accounts, what have you, where we talk about these things.
Yeah. As I mentioned to you earlier, if June has killed your crypto dreams, now's probably a good time to start looking for a job.
Didn't kill mine, man.
I got out of it last May, so I'm doing great.
Yeah, crypto and NFTs, not high confidence there, and still not high confidence. Speaking of not high confidence,
we're killing the segues today, by the way.
Yeah, segue king right here. Let's talk about ProctorU.
This will be quick, blessedly. I mean, especially coming on the heels of April where things really fell apart. I saw very few issues, which isn't to say none. It wasn't perfect, but a far better testing experience that we had in April where we had that hours-long outage for everyone. There was nothing like that occurred this time.
No, and we'll always say the same thing. Even having a few issues, which is good on the whole, it's still terrible for the people who were affected. If you were sitting there waiting for an hour to start or an hour during the break, or you couldn't even get connected, or you had like 20 proctors coming through or messing with your test, taking control of your mouse, not pausing time, those things are all terrible, and they make the experience, it's very binary. It's either, hey, that was just fine, or alternatively, that was horrendous. I saw a lot of complaints about rude proctors this time as well. That's not usually what I see as a primary complaint, but I saw more than a few comments about my proctor was rude to me, laughed at me at one point. One person on a forum was told, well, don't take the test under accommodated conditions. And I'm like,
oh, wow,
buddy, that's, now you're getting into like lawsuit territory. Yeah, be careful with the comments like that, Mr. Proctor.
Yeah, it's usually some degree of almost like polite ignorance, where they're very friendly but have no idea what the LSAT is or the nature of your experience.
Yeah, they don't realize what a high-stakes test it actually is. But on the whole, the number of problems that were reported were less, than certainly we saw last time out, but not overall. I didn't see any real issues here.
Yeah, that all said, there's no guarantees that there won't be issues in the future as well. So 2 quick tips that I'll provide for people. The first is try to engage your proctor before you start testing and essentially establish a couple of things. Remind them that if they do need to get your attention or interrupt you for any reason, they can and should pause the timer first, because they cannot put more time back on your clock, but they can pause it if they need you to do something. Tell them that. Remind them of that.
Let me interrupt here or really add on to what you're saying.
Either's fine.
A lot of times I see people saying, well, I asked them to do it and they wouldn't. And, then, I just had to deal with it. And my reaction to that is, look, you don't want to get emotionally upset during the test if you can help avoid it. But if they don't pause your time, this is to me as a direct attack on your testing experience. I would start becoming angry and insistent, even if you have to fake it. Start yelling, pause my time, because they're stealing from you. That's exactly what this is. You've paid for this testing time. When it is being taken from you, it's theft. So don't allow it. And, sometimes proctors are like, what? They don't even know they can do it. So when you start up the testing experience, engage with them, talk to them about what it is that your expectations are. Hey, if we have a problem, pause it. And also realize that sometimes proctors change during the test. So you might talk to one person and 30 minutes later, you've got another person proctoring. But advocate for yourself. You want to be an attorney? Advocate for yourself right now. This is one of the most important moments on your personal journey that you can take control of.
Yeah, that's a good point. Obviously, you can't see when new proctors show up. It couldn't, you're not able to give this admonishment to every single person who might show up on the other end of your camera. But you can do it at the beginning, and that, to me, is at least worth something. And the second thing is, speaking of self-advocacy, if something does go wrong, then you haven't been given the experience that you were promised and that you paid for. And you are then entitled to some kind of like remuneration. And that remuneration in this case comes in the form of a makeup exam the following week. We just mentioned that there's one next week for this test. You file a complaint through your LSAC account and document any issues. And remember, because this is all recorded, there's hard copy. There's actual evidence and receipts, as it were, about this. So they can go back and see exactly what happened and what the proctor or the interface perhaps did incorrectly. You can make a very easy case for yourself if something's gone wrong, and you should do so.
Yeah, and they'll go back and look at the tape, and if they see, well, yep, here's we got a problem, they'll grant the retake. Typically, they're looking for more catastrophic situations, so 15-second delay isn't going to qualify, but you start getting into longer minutes lost and so forth, then it gets to that point where they're much more likely to grant that.
Yeah. The only downside to that is, and I got asked this question today, so it's on my mind, Dave. Someone said, will I get to choose which score I want, or will I get to pick which test? No. Will I get the same test? No. I was near the end. Can I just finish that test? No. A makeup test is a clean restart with new content, and it will entirely replace your prior performance, regardless of whether you do better, the same, or worse.
Yeah, and it's hard to know whether that's fair to you or unfair to you. It really just depends on how the performance turns out on the second one. For some people, it's been great. For other people, it hasn't been. Now, speaking of fairness or unfairness.
Look at you.
I set that one up. Let's talk about, very briefly, the research logic game section that was given as the fourth section on a number of Saturday tests. And we're not going to go deeply into this. If you want a deep analysis and discussion of it, listen to our prior episode on this topic, because we do talk about it, verified that it was legitimate and an intentional thing. And so if you got to the end of your test and it was section 4 and it said this section is unscored, and then you got really just a couple of brief mini logic games or long LR looking type of stimuli with a bunch of survey questions about scratch paper, they intended to do that to you. They weren't lying. That section does not count. But I know that engendered a lot of conversations about fairness and unfairness and whether or not it was a reasonable thing to have done for just some of the people. And we talked about that in our other episode, our prior episode. So yeah. I would say go back and listen to that, because we're not going to rehash all of that now.
And not to self-hype too much, but it's a fascinating discussion and a really interesting look at two things that I thought were prescient. One was this issue of what does this mean for the future of the test, something that all of us are interested in. And then something else that all of us are interested in is what's the fairness, what's the right take on the equity, or the just the general nature of how this may or may not have advantaged or privileged versus disadvantaged certain people as to who got it. These are fascinating insights into the world of LSAC and how they see things, and frankly, into the outcomes for test takers.
Yeah, and that's in podcast episode 112. I also posted a blog on this called the June 2022 LSAT experimental section. What happened?
What happened?
Yeah, we posted that on Saturday night at like 9:01 Eastern time, so that students who were looking around for answers could find them and understand that what happened to them was not unique and it was intentional and didn't kind of like cancel their test in any way. Speaking of tests, John.
You ready?
I'm ready.
We usually do this long disclaimer list. I'm happy to let that trend continue.
Thanks.
Do you want it? Do you want a big gulp of your Dirty Shirley first?
What a gift. Here, there's the Dirty Shirley right there.
My man.
Yes, it's quite good. I mean, I like drinks that have sugar in them, and Shirley Temple is really a classically great drink. There's a reason kids like it so much. You add vodka to it, and it's... I'm disappointed that we as adults didn't think about this earlier. Why did it take so long for us to come up with this excellent drink?
I have no comments on that. I have a lot of comments on that, but none of them are fit for...
No, they're all excellent. Let's run down some reminders and disclaimers on public test content, especially for those of you who have never listened to one of these and may be wondering, how do they do it? Why do they do it? Is it, based upon any kind of fact, or is it just guesswork? So first off, a lot of this is going to relate to public knowledge, especially when we see people talking about test content. What it allows us to do is to take that information and connect it back to a fairly substantial database that we have on all test usages over the last 15 years or so. And that covers tests that were experimentals on released exams. It covers non-disclosed February exams. It covers Sabbath tests when they used to have those, as well as international tests. And sometimes the information that we have is very extensive. Sometimes it's less extensive. And when that's the case, we are upfront about our information was thinner on this than on others. In some instances, our knowledge of sections that have been administered is vast. We know all the rules of all the games. We know most all the answers. We know all the questions that were asked. In other cases, it's not that far. So it really depends, but that does inform the predictions that we make. Another thing I'll remind people, especially when they're considering their test and even when they're talking online afterwards, section order doesn't mean anything. You can have yourself and another test taker with reading comprehension first and third. You might not have had the same section 1 and same section 3. They could have been reversed, for example. You might have had different sections on today's LSAT. Sections and orders change all day long. LSAC is attacking you during the test and other test takers by intentionally trying to confuse things. So be aware of that. Don't just say, oh, you had RC 1 and 3. I had the same test. I see that so often online, and to be honest, it irks me to no end. That is just assuming we're not knowing enough about the way the test is actually administered. Keep this in mind, too, about disclosing test information. LSAC has said that, especially after the main testing days end, you can talk about the generalities of the test, difficulty, the topics of, say, logical reasoning questions, logic games, and reading comprehension. They want you to avoid specifics. Don't post information about the game types or the question types in LR or answers or how you solved problems. That's something that they'll allow a little bit later, but they still don't love it. We don't actually need that information. We have people who take the test. We have all this other database information. We get enough information from the topics to actually piece all of this together, I think, very accurately, and that's been proven historically. Another reminder that I'll give is that when you take the real LSAT, it's terrible. They're all difficult, and it always feels worse than a practice test because you know that it counts and your mind cannot escape that truth. And so there's a negativity bias that tends to creep into the recollections that individual students have when they leave this exam. That was the worst test ever is one of the most common things for John and I to hear from students afterwards. It probably wasn't. It just felt that way because of all the extra pressure. It also means that when we talk scale predictions, sometimes people will think, well, that was a super hard section, and we won't classify it as super hard. A lot of times that's because we're looking from more the 30,000-foot view where we're trying to say, how did the collective actually view this? Whereas individuals can vary in their opinions. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but all LSAT sections are hard. And we're just talking about gradations of difficulty, but they're all on the high difficulty side. And so when we say something's easier or harder, it's all relative to a mid-level baseline of being hard. I don't think any LSAT section is easy. I might say one is easier than another, but I still think they're both hard. And then again, the test makers are actively attempting to confuse you, a lot of times by placing similar topics in different sections of different tests. So you might have something, and I'll use a classic example that we know of in reading comprehension, the topic of Nigeria. A lot of times people use one word to describe a reading comp passage. There's been tests where there's been different reading comprehension sections. Each of them had passages about Nigeria, but the passages were of different topics and different questions. That's just something they do to confuse. I had Nigeria too. You did? Excellent. No, you didn't. You're talking about two different passages, but you may not ever realize it. This is a known tactic that they use. They do it almost every single test. They did it again on this one. So, also, our estimations of what's real and what's experimental are based on certain assumptions about reusage, namely that prior scored sections, when they're reused, will also be scored and will not be experimental sections. We haven't seen them deviate from that, but be aware that that's an assumption that all of this is built on. It's also possible that you're not going to hear your section in the discussion below. Sometimes you won't recall some of the questions that are being asked. That happens. Sometimes, especially on Saturday, the information about which sections were being used in the question topics is so limited, we might not realize that a section was used. If people don't tell us this was your test and these were the topics that you had, there's no way for us to add it to the database of cross-referencing here to say, did it actually occur? So the other thing I'll ask is that this podcast, we ultimately reduce these tests down into scale predictions. We ask that you not summarize this online. Summaries often miss the nuance. Sometimes people are like, wait, I didn't have that test, and they don't know why we said certain things about it. We want people to hear what we have to say directly. So that is pretty much the way that it breaks down in terms of disclaimers, John. And I took a little bit extra time because I'm feeling expansive today, so sorry.
I just thought you knew I was thirsty. That gave me a chance to top off over here, so thank you.
Well, there you go.
I'm going to add one additional disclaimer to this that we'll expand on as we get deeper into the actual content, which is this was another really difficult test for us to track information. You know, in April, we had a hard time because we lost half a day on Saturday and it just scattered people to the wind. This time, we had a different issue on Saturday, which again, we covered in the last episode and you referenced here. As soon as that new logic game experimental announced fourth section started happening, there was more or less a media blackout where people weren't being allowed to talk about things. They were being censored online. And again, we touched on that in the last episode. It'll come up again today, I'm sure. But it just makes our ability to track this fluidly and consistently from start to finish very difficult. Yeah, so it's possible we may have missed something here. I'll always put that.
There was a filter that was put on Reddit, for example, where people couldn't post about it. They just stopped it and deleted it before it even showed up. And that actually chills a lot of the conversation that might actually go on. And so that affects it. I think you and I are comfortable that we have all the real sections.
I think so.
That were administered over the weekend and on Tuesday. There's a sneaking suspicion that we might have missed an experimental section, maybe an LR floating around out there. So we'll have to see. So if somebody came to me later on and said, I think I had a section you didn't talk about, I would probably say, okay, let's look at that. Tell me about it. And then I'm imagining that I'll conclude that it was an experimental. But just that's the breaks of the game. If information doesn't come to us, we can't make an adjudication on it. That's just the bottom line. And so we always tell that to people. It's like, if you don't give us the information, there's no podcast. That's really the way it works.
Yeah. I'm not sure if that's encouragement to stop giving us information or to give us as much as you can. I can see benefits to both.
But because you can skip doing the podcast. Less work for you. You're lazy. I prefer to be able to do the podcast. So.
Well, since we're here, I guess I do too. And let's start internationally. Let's get into that international June test.
Yeah, this is, this was just given on Tuesday. So for us, that was yesterday. It's not the biggest component of the LSATs that were given. The Friday and Saturday domestic test takers were bigger. But we knew immediately, much to our happiness, that what was being used was a test that we have seen many times before. Mm-hmm. First and foremost, you would say that this is the February 2014 LSAT. That was a non-disclosed LSAT at that time. So no one ever saw it back in February 2014, but that was the main administration of this exam. And the reason that non-disclosed LSATs exist is so they can be reused and still be clean to a new audience. And so this test has actually been reused on multiple occasions. It was reused in July 2018. It was the Sabbath test in February 2020. It was the Flex test in February 2021. It was the March 2021 Flex makeup. And here it comes again, now added to the list, is the June 2022 International LSAT. So we know a lot about this test. And John, I'll just start with the logic game section because that is the most notable of the sections here. Is that fair?
Yeah, completely. This is the section where specifically a moment in this section, as soon as I hear even a whisper of it, I know exactly. It's February 2014.
Yes, and that's because it is the last true circular game that has really been administered. Mm-hmm. So the logic game section on this exam should have been 23 questions. The games feature art installations and then a garden kind of like department store with floors for furniture, gardening, and housewares. A game about schools and plays, and then a game about 8 diplomats sitting clockwise at a circular table. It's kind of like junior, senior. I don't know if they're moderators or translators or delegates. It's kind of like a delegation.
I think they're all of them. Yeah.
They're all of them. Okay. And it's like a double-tiered circular game. In fact, we have a great blog on how to attack. I think it's called like the 7th level of hell, double-tiered circular games. that we often tell people to review just on the off chance that this test will be used, because it's not the same games, obviously, but the principles of how to deal with a circular game with multiple positions are discussed, just like we would talk about any linear or grouping type of game.
It was born out of the appearance of this game when it originally came about because it caused so much consternation. We felt like we actually had to explain the principle behind it. And for those who were in the crystal ball and paying attention, I linked to that blog post once, maybe twice, in the chat as you were talking about games, Dave. I said, if you're going to get a circular game, you need to read this post. Please do yourself a favor. Any international students who took the time to read that blog post should have been in great shape here.
Well, I know that they did because I received a message from one saying, thank you so much for linking that. I'd read that, and it wasn't that it solved the game for me, but it did what I consider to be equally important. It calmed them when they arrived at it. They're like, oh, it felt very current to them that they were conversant with the ideas and in touch with what was going on. And having that calm confidence during the LSAT it's basically worth its weight in gold.
Yeah.
It's huge to have that. And that's a lot of what we do in the crystal ball in the first place, is we talk about predictions and we direct people into areas where we feel as if what they will see is going to match what is coming up on the test. And that gives them a greater degree of comfort. That is the value of what we're doing there.
Yeah. Well, it paid off here in a big, big way. I don't know if that's the hardest circular game ever, but it'd be hard for me to come up with competition for it. I think it's probably the trickiest one out there.
Yeah, and I'll note for anybody who wasn't listening carefully, you didn't say the hardest game ever, you said the hardest circular game ever.
Within a narrow band of type. Hardest circular.
Now you're challenging me to go make some drill based upon the hardest circular game ever. I might take you up on that.
You really read between the lines in ways that I can't always track.
You know I like to do these things.
At no point did I challenge you to make that drill.
I take everything as a challenge. So I was like, what? You think that's the hardest? I'll make something harder. And I'll tell you how I would actually build it, John. Huh? The very first thing I would say is that it's not fixed how many people are around the table. That it's somewhere between 6 and 9 people.
A table can seat up to 9 delegates.
Yeah, that's how I would do it. And LSAC furiously taking notes right now.
If they want to make it doubly cruel, it has to be an odd number, because then no one sits directly across from each other.
True, but it does make the game harder from a rule standpoint. I really like games where it's an even number, but we digress. And that was not what we intended to do here. So we'll move back into the reading comprehension. You want to do reading comp or you want me?
Yeah, I don't mind.
All right.
So also from February 2014, although this one's got a little more history to it, this originally appeared as a June 2011 experimental section. 27 questions. Here were the 4 passages. There was a passage about the French Revolution and women's rights. This had to do with feminist theories. There was a passage about common and international law regarding indigenous tribes and rights in Brazil. Or Belize, rather. Sorry, different B. So common and international law in Belize. Art and sports commentators who were talking about competition and the aesthetics of competition. That was your comparative passage. It was tricky. And then finally, another one of these physics passages, chaotic systems in physics. This had to do with the theory of everything. So how do you marry things like relativity with quantum mechanics? Easily the hardest passage, it seems, in that section.
Not really the easiest RC.
No, this was a tricky RC section on the whole. You really just didn't get a break here. The easiest passage might have been that French Revolution one, and even that was somewhat dense. And a bit obscure. I don't think any of these passages, if you're just hearing about them, you're like, I don't know much about indigenous rights in Belize or much about feminist theories regarding the French Revolution and how it came about. These are all tricky.
Yeah, notice how this test lines up very well with the modern tests of the last couple of years, a really tough RC. And as we'll talk about in a moment, the LR, as always, challenging. Always a few strange questions, the question types in there, but not terrible. And logic games kind of in the middle, maybe overall. So as we look at this, you've got a logic game section that's pretty easy to identify. The reading comprehension also fairly easy to identify. LR gets harder just because for the everybody who was taking it internationally, there's 25 questions is hard to remember. A lot of people had 50 questions, so it really becomes difficult to separate those out. But let's start with one of the scored sections.
Okay.
This was 25 questions, and I'll give some of the topics here. School lunches and extracurricular activities, birds evolving from manoraptors, kind of like about birds and dinosaur bones. Anthropologists teaching with novels, plants releasing CO2, psychologists going on about empathy and morality, wine and grapes, a business going out of business if the main competitor goes out of business, bioluminescent crabs and ultraviolet light, and continuing on. There's more questions in this section. We have a massive amount of information about this section. But this was a scored sections. So if you had this section on your test, and we think the majority of people, perhaps all of them had this section, this was your scored between the two.
This was definitely the main one. Yeah, I don't know if it was everyone, but it was certainly the vast majority from what we could tell.
Yeah. And let's quickly go over the other logical reasoning section that was used on February 2014, because although we didn't talk to anybody who had this, it is very possible that other people did. So if you had this section, it would have been scored as well. Nutritional deficiencies in social programs, exoskeletons, pesticides used in various countries, babies and parents buying teddy bears, and the bears look like the babies instead of stuffed bears, which is weird. I don't want everyone to read that question, but we'll unfortunately be forced to at some point. Rival toy companies, shrimp health effects in shrimp farms. And it seemed like there may have been more than one shrimp question floating around. So make sure that the topic there matches up. Buses versus driving, and then artificial lab experiments with human subjects should not be something that you rely on.
Yeah. It's a question I would like to read, actually.
That sounds more interesting. Babies and teddy bears just sounds creepy to me. I don't want my child's face on a teddy bear.
First of all, said the grown man drinking a Shirley Temple.
Hey, Shirley Temple has vodka in it, so you can just drop off.
All right. I agree, that's a little creepy. Teddy bears with kid's face? No, thanks. But we do know that all of those topics were originally scored in February 2014. So if you did see any of those again on Tuesday, they were scored for you as well. That's a good way you can distinguish.
So that takes us to the matrix for the international test. And let's talk about this, especially for those of you who have never heard us do this discussion. We focus on predictions to get a 170. So you typically are running about 75 questions on the average LSAT. It does vary around here. I think this international LSAT was 75 questions exactly that were scored. And so the point that we're looking at is how many questions can you miss to get a 170? And the marker that we start with for that is that you can miss 7 questions. So we start on the idea of -7 or missing 7 questions to get a 170. And then we make individual adjustments to that assessment based upon the relative difficulty of each of the sections to kind of like the overall whole of all sections of all time. So let's take a look first at the reading comprehension here. This was a tough section, as I said before, and it actually aligns very well with the kind of like modern LSAT with harder reading comp. This is going to loosen your scale, meaning that you can now, it's going to loosen it by 1. You can miss 8 questions to get a 170. Then the logical reasonings, both of these are reasonable from a scoring standpoint. That doesn't mean that they're easy. There's always hard questions in LR, but compared to typical LR sections, they're no harder or easier. And so there's no effect there. So we're still at -8. And then last, logic games here. And we've talked about this section before. You and I have always really varied between, is it hard enough to move the scale by 1 or should it stay where it is? And in the past, because we really didn't do any of these half-point increments, we kind of kept it at 0. And after looking at it a little bit more and kind of going through specifically that circular game, you and I are going to kind of count this as 0.5, which means that the scale really stays at -8 for a 170. But that game section is hard enough that as you move down the scale, it should loosen the scale a little bit.
For sure.
Yeah. So at the 160 level, you would see a benefit from having taken this. The scale would be, a question looser there than it normally would be. But in the upper echelon, probably not. So -8 for the international test takers. And as we've said, that's been the scale prediction for a long time on that. But we really feel like that logic games opens it up a little bit downscale.
Yeah, if I had to lay a wager, I'd probably go -9 here.
But what's our rule when we're actually making scale predictions?
When in doubt, be conservative. Yes. I know.
Yes. So if we're not sure whether it's 8 or 9, and there's a reasonable debate among learned minds, we're going to go with 8.
Yeah.
There you go.
But again, my instinct here is to round it up, in part because the first time we recorded some of this stuff, we didn't have nearly as much flex content that had been scaled by the test makers to actually compare it to. I think this is a harder game section than either of the -9 tests, PT90 plus, PT92 plus, that now exist. So relative to what we have learned, I think that has to inform some of our perspective as well.
Look, you make really good points.
What?
Yeah, you heard it. I didn't say they were all good. I just you make some good ones.
Thank you. But yeah, I could see this going to -9. I could also see it being -8. It's hard to say too with that LR, because there's a chance. I don't think the LR was as difficult as some of the other stuff we're about to talk about. It's possible that I actually tightened it back up a little.
That's exactly the case. So who knows? I mean, this is where it gets difficult. But part of the reason that we only predict 170 levels is because it's easiest for us to see the high level difficulty. It's much harder for us to see the mid-level difficulty questions, because a lot of times people miss those without realizing it. Whereas if something's truly hard and it's going to affect everybody, everyone knows it, and it's much more easily seen.
Yeah.
Anyway,
we're cataloging like the greatest degrees of difficulty here, because those are the things that we can quantify. It's really hard for us to look and be like, I bet that's like a 68% kind of question.
It's like looking at a mountain range, John. The things that stand out are the highest peaks.
That's right.
You know, somebody's like, I know what that mountain is. That's Mount Whitney, or, you know, whatever, you know, mountain range they're actually looking at. They don't know all the names of the lower ones because they don't stand out as much. It's the same type of principle here. We see the biggest peaks and understand those most easily. That's the international test. Let's move to the domestic June LSAT, which is by far the majority of people who are listening and wondered why we talked about that test, the international one, for so long, because it's fun.
In fact, it's a greater majority than people may realize, because this domestic test also is going to include the paper and pencil test takers from Tuesday as well. I suppose you could call it a fortunate break, fortunate for us at the very least, because what we saw is that the paper and pencil test also included the content that we had seen from Friday and Saturday. Mm-hmm. So if you just took a paper test on Tuesday, this is for you as well.
Yeah, so this is Friday, Saturday, and Tuesday, people. Everybody but international and makeup test people for next week. So, John, I'll let you start off with Logic Games and enjoy that.
Sure. Well, let's just kick things off where they began, which was Friday morning, bright and early. And interestingly enough, what we saw were partial uses of 2 of the LSATs that we had predicted were going to occur here. From our crystal ball, things that we had anticipated would occur, they did. And straight away, we saw these in use on Friday. I'm going to talk to you about the 2 Logic Game sections that were real, that appeared. One of these was all day Friday. The other was all day Saturday with a bit of Friday repeat mixed in. The Friday games were these. These were 23 questions, and they came from the July 2020 LSAT, one of the ones that we predicted.
Wait, where did we predict it at?
Our crystal ball, Dave, prior to the June test. You highlighted, I think, 3 tests, and 2 of those 3 are exactly what occured here.
Yes.
One of them is this.
Once again, I say, especially because somebody I saw online, they were like, there's no way they can predict anything. I was like, we shouldn't be able to, yet we continue to do so. So I'm right now, if my neck didn't hurt so much, I would be patting myself on the back.
Fair enough. I'll just use both my hands, and it'll be one for each of us. These were the 4 games from that July 2020 test. They were real. If you took the test on Friday, these should ring a bell for you. The first game was about expert witnesses being called to testify. The next game was about planting crops, vegetables, I believe, in north and south fields over, I think, 3 days. The next game, the third, was about a cabinet maker apprentices assigned to different projects. And then finally, duets performing in a talent show, singing duets. And there were, I think, 3 different pairs of people who were going to perform in this show. But on the whole, and we'll get into the specifics in terms of quantifying it, but on the whole, this was a fairly standard section. Good mix of linearity and grouping, some advanced linear stuff. Exactly what we expected to see from exactly the test we expected to see it from.
There you go. So that was one of the real sections. And then there was another one that we saw kind of come into play a little bit later. in the weekend. What happened there?
The first time that I noticed this was bright and early Saturday morning, where we saw that there were different games in play. 23 questions as well, and these 4 games are what we saw. The first one, interestingly enough, had a little confusion about it, but I believe it was bridges being repaired. The second one was about 2 debate teams arguing over support and opposition for wearing school uniforms, mandatory uniforms. The third game was about litigators, lawyers on different teams, and they had specialties. Some were personal injury, some were medical malpractice, a couple were both. And then finally, the last game was about 5 volunteers apparently working shifts on a Friday and Saturday, various work shifts.
Yeah, the Friday, Saturday being the component that almost everybody remembered. Some people were like, did that have catering, flowing into it? We focused on this section quite a bit because of the Saturday segment when you had a lot of people who had this section because they had that 4th research section, supposedly logic games, but really just research. So there was a lot of conversation about this section. I think we have a tremendous amount of information. And part of the reason there's confusion on that first game is because it was fairly straightforward. People were like straight up, linear game, 6 variables. They just smashed through it and then they moved on. And then the games that went on were a little bit harder or more interesting and had unusual features. Not notably unusual, but just something different that wasn't clearly obvious. They had to stop and think a little bit more. And so for a lot of people, the second, third, and fourth games left a much greater imprint than that first game. So I think that's where that uncertainty came from.
For sure. It's a bit of a paradox that sometimes the easier the game, the less people can recall about it. It just doesn't make an imprint.
Yeah, you think like, well, that was easy. That'll be simple to remember, but that's not how it works. It's where you struggled for a moment and had to look back at the scenario and read the rules a few times and really kind of had to work through it, that the words and the concepts of the game tend to have a greater impact and they leave a mark.
But that was the grand total of all the logic games that I saw. Friday, Saturday, and Tuesday for domestic paper and pencil accommodated people. 2 sections, that was it.
Yeah, now could there have been a real logic games experimental that was out there? Yeah, there could be.
A real experimental? What do you mean?
Well, a experimental logic games. Probably I shouldn't say real experimental in this context. But a legitimate, because that 4th section that was research was not what I would call a real experimental. It wasn't a true experimental. So the question here is was there anybody out there who had 2 logic game sets and there was one of these scored ones and then an actual 4-game full-on 35-minute non-research section? It's possible. We didn't hear from or talk to anybody who had that set up, so we can't really report on it. If anybody did, let me know because we'll add it to our notes for the future. But these were the 2 sections that we saw on Logic Games, and both of these were scored and were real. So we'll come back to the matrix on that, but let's move on to reading comprehension.
Yes, where we get quite a bit more content, frankly. And I'm going to go through this in a non-chronological type of way, because what we saw on Friday were essentially 2 different reading comp test compositions. One had a single reading comp section, so we knew that it was real. We saw this early Friday, and it ran throughout the day and throughout the weekend, frankly. But then there was a paired set of reading comp, and I know people are going to want to get to that. I'm going to save the pair for last. There was another single reading comp that came in on Saturday, or at least late Friday evening and mostly Saturday. So let me start with the 2 single reading comp sections, both of which, of course, are real, but these were easy for us to identify. These happened on tests with other types of experimental sections. One real set of reading comprehension, 27 questions, came from another test that we predicted. Games were from July 2020. This reading comprehension section was from January 2021.
All right, so once again, predicted in the crystal ball that we did several weeks ago was this test, and here it is.
Yes, and it had these 4 passages, ones that we recognized straight away. The first passage was on Kafka. It was a discussion of his work and criticism, frankly, of it. The second passage, I believe, was on theories of the Big Bang and the expanding universe. It was based around a Neil deGrasse Tyson essay. There was a passage on legal environmental policy that had to do with dumping pollutants into water sources. And then finally, a passage about UN diplomats and diplomacy. Those were real, And those were, again, familiar to us, in part because we were expecting to see those. But as soon as I saw Kafka, I was like, oh, we know what that is.
And as I've said before, I really like to read this.
You're a big Kafka fan.
I'm a Kafka fan, and I'd be very interested in seeing what, the LSAT has to say about Kafka.
That was also the comparative passage in that section. So you would have gotten two perspectives on old Franz. And weirdly enough, unusually enough, it started the section. It's very rare that you see a comparative passage first.
Yeah. It's something like 14% of the time it shows up first. Part of the reason, that I would really like to read it is I think that sometimes dealing with LSAC is like dealing with the trial. And so that kind of crazy bureaucracy and administrative nightmare. So for me, the fact that they've put a Kafka passage on the test, for those of you who've read the trial and know Kafka pretty well, you have to appreciate the parallel between LSAC and what, the narrator has to go through in that book.
I will also say, in my estimation, that was probably the hardest of the three sections of real reading comprehension that we saw. I think that was the toughest overall. So you can probably guess where we're going with that. Let's get to another real section. And again, this always appeared individually. So with other types of experimental, we saw this a lot on Saturday, although it first appeared Friday night. So this appeared a lot with the double logic game, weird experimental thing. 27 questions. Here were the passages. The first was on the history of juries, the, quote, tradition of jury selection. The second was on a choreographer. Do you have something?
Yeah, I wanted to point out that the jury selection thing here, be careful. There were multiple sections that had juries on them. This is an example of them trying to confuse. There's another passage we're going to come to later on about like jury docs and defendant positioning in the courtroom. That is not this passage.
Good point. Again, it's one of those other clear attempts of LSAC trying to confuse you by duplicate topics in different places. But in this case, it was about the history of how juries were chosen, essentially. There was a passage 2, I believe, on Zora Neale Hurston, a choreographer who brought Bahamian and tribal dance to the mainstream, the question being, does that qualify her as a choreographer? The third passage here was on folk psychology, economics, and modern science. A lot of people talked about that. That was also the comparative passage in this section. And it wrapped up with a passage on movement and physics and gymnastics. I think it was a balancing experiment, dealt with somersaults and robots, apparently. Yeah, so something on kinesiology, perhaps. Those were all real, but a slightly more accessible section than the Kafka stuff we touched on before. And we knew these were both real because, again, they appeared in isolation. They were alone as the single reading comp task on these test forms.
Yeah, anybody who had that research section automatically knew that their first 3 sections were scored walking out, and that meant 1 RC, 1 LG, and 1 LR were automatically in the bag as far as these are real. So the amount of information we got on certain sections was extraordinarily high. I got a range of feedback on this section, from this was easy to I didn't like this section, it was hard. So we'll come back and talk a little bit more about that. But that's just something to note, is that if you felt this section was hard, there were a lot of people who didn't. And if you felt this section was easy, there were definitely some people who didn't agree with that. So that range often ends up landing more towards the middle. Let's go on to...
You mentioned the challenge of identifying real versus experimental, and where that gets particularly sticky is if you have 2 sets of reading comprehension passages, which a lot of people did, particularly on Friday. And this, I think, is going to be one of those big moments for people. I imagine there's going to be an eruption of cheers out there as I tell you what's about to happen. I hope, anyway. I always hope. So what we saw was a pair of passage sets, particularly, as I said, on Friday, one of which, by almost all accounts, was significantly harder than the other. And so people were going back and forth, clamorous to learn which of the 2 counted and which didn't. Yeah. I can now confirm for you which of those 2 sets was real.
So this was the double RC people, largely on Friday. Not to say that it didn't happen on Saturday, but it certainly started. We saw a lot of this on Friday. 2 people with RC, or 2 RCs, trying to figure out which one was real. Go right ahead, John.
Thank you very much. I get the big reveal. Appreciate it. So the real section here, there's 2 ways we know. One is because we were able to actually match it from a brief moment in July of 2020, another test that we predicted in the crystal ball. And then we also started to see this appear as the single reading comp with people with those double games on Saturday. So we got a lot of confirmation. We are absolutely certain that the real passages here were Passage 1, rent control laws before and after World War II. Passage 2, assemblage art about John Outerbridge. Passage 3, and this is the jury one, defendant's positioning in a courtroom. This had to do with jury docks and glass boxes, proximity to the jury. And then passage 4, a recognizable one, plants and grasses, how they adapt to non-plant or non-native species. Those 4 passages were real. And I'm hoping and expecting that that is probably very good news for the vast majority of people.
Yeah, because a lot of people said that the other passage set in this, which was experimental, was one of the hardest they'd ever seen. And so they were praying.
Do you want to hit those 4?
I do. They were praying that this other section was experimental, and we can confirm that it was. This was about the limitation of simulations, dealing with like astrophysics, the life of stars and galaxies. A very notable passage on Machiavelli's The Prince, passage about trademarks, so a classic law-related one. And then finally, one that got described a lot of different ways, but about the Iroquois and the Confederation there, the founding date of that, with kind of like tied into Native American history. And so that was 27 questions. That was very often paired with the passage set that Jon just talked about with assemblage art and the invasive grasses and so forth. But this one with Machiavelli, experimental, which is Machiavellian to put really difficult and challenging RC into the mix like this.
Yes. Grasses, real. Life of stars and galaxies, simulations and astrophysics, Machiavelli, did not count. You can ignore it, forget it ever happened to you. The best you can.
And that's that for RC.
Yeah. There you go. So happily, of all 4 sections we just covered, the one that was experimental, and again, we are sure of this, easily the hardest, and now you can forget about it.
Yeah. Let's move on to LR.
Hooray.
So let's open up with some of the real sections that we know are out there, and then briefly cover some of the experimental sections. And here I feel like our information got a little bit thinner overall. I feel like we understand pretty well about the real sections. The experimental section was a little bit thinner, primarily because a lot of people on Saturday didn't have an experimental of any notable sort. They didn't have an LR. So there was a huge dearth of information there. And then with the blackout that occurred on a lot of forums, there was even less information floating around in general. So unless somebody, shared their topics with us later on, it was really difficult. So is it possible that we've missed a section in here? Yeah. Do I think we missed one of the real ones? I certainly hope not, and I don't think so. I think the majority of people, if not every single one of them, had one of the 2 real sections we're about to identify. So let's go through the very first one. This was one about, and this is a very notable question, one of the first ones that people often talked about, crows and remembering people wearing masks. Of course, I'd like to read that because crows are supposed to be extremely intelligent and apparently have long memories of their interactions with people.
I've read they have the mathematical abilities of a 7-year-old. I don't know how you measure that, but I know they can count and keep track of things.
I mean, my 7-year-old could do like geometry and stuff, so that's pretty good.
Can she fly?
No, that crow's got her beat 1-0.
There you go. 1-0.
Crow doesn't throw much of a tantrum, but sure squawks loud. As well as government lending support to organic farming, big or giant ant fossils, bans musical styles in 1969 or a ban changing musical styles, consent and recording telephone calls, the importance of taking your pet to the same vet over time, humans cooking and the evolution of teeth, rock wall paintings, depicting shaman practices, a really notable question because people will call it the, rock wall shaman. Internet is a basic human right. And then one that also seems interesting to me since I like dogs quite a bit, dogs seeing other dogs getting treats and being able to judge the fairness, shaking hands and so forth. That was a real section if you got it.
Yeah, I believe that dogs question was the final question in the section. So if you don't recognize it and you didn't finish, that's why.
That's okay. Let's go to another real section, and this involved topics including fluorescence, the role of villains in a movie, birds, might have been seagulls eating seashells to gain calcium in their diet, overdue library books, television programs about extraterrestrials and executives being irresponsible promoting that kind of trash, cooking chicken, and then hearing damage to musicians in orchestras, which I think would be, interesting to read. A little bit of tinnitus-based LR there. So that was another real section. And then we have a couple of experimental sections, and it's, this is where it got really hard for us to distinguish. But we feel fairly confident about this. There could be some sliding questions in here. So I'll say hold us to it, but don't really hold us to it. The first one that was experimental involved questions including small class sizes improving results related to private schools, employee job satisfaction, commercial development in a neighborhood that didn't want commercial development, and then a question about wills written in one's own handwriting. And then finally, another passage that we know that we saw, I believe it was the paper and pencil testers. Some of them had this, dealt with magma plumes and how that moved Pangaea continental bodies around, the ideals of gift giving, esoteric philosophy, question about drunk drivers and criminal history, and then finally the spouses of smokers and non-smokers and how that related to lung disease. And there are a few other questions that we have listed in there, but I think that's enough to get the gist of it across. But those last two were experimental. The former two, the crows remembering people with masks and the dogs, as well as like the role of villains in a movie and overdue library books, those were real.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny that the two questions I think I saw the most mentioned both had to do with birds. One was crows and masks, and the other I think was seagulls with seashells and calcium.
You see some seagulls in LA. I see them where I live every once in a while floating above me, and I'm like, what are you doing so far from the coast, friend? You need to get out of here. This is fire country, not ocean country.
Well, there you go. So I think that covers everything we were able to track. And again, to put this caveat on it one final time, there was something of a dark period through most of Saturday where information just dried up by design, not our design, but by LSAC's censorship designs.
That's exactly right. So let's just, now that we've talked about what was real, what was experimental, we joked throughout about the crystal ball predictions that we made. And I just want to recap that and not be, quite so comedic about it or attempted comedy. Some of the tests that we predicted in there was I had highlighted 3 tests, and 2 of those 3 tests were July 2020 and January 2021 being reused as very high likely candidates. And sure enough, portions of both of these tests were used. And I would like to remind people that when we do that crystal ball, one of the things we do in conjunction with it is we make recommended problem sets that are based upon those predictions and send people to do the types of games and passages in LR that we think they're going to see. So one of the most gratifying things was that afterwards, I began getting messages saying, crystal ball, spot on, thank you. Crushed it, felt really good. Everything I saw was kind of very much in the vein of what I expected. And I would remind people that, first and foremost, PowerScore is in the business of helping people prepare to take the LSAT and do as well as possible. This is our job. And I think John and I take a lot of pride in doing it as well as we can. And getting it right like this is hugely gratifying because we can actually see it in action as people respond to us. So if you're taking that August or September test, come join us on July 7th and see us do the crystal ball. It changes every single time because obviously we change it in advance of these tests based upon what we've just seen. So it'll change again. And now that we've had this happen, this is going to narrow our prediction and change it a little bit. It'll change the problem sets that we predict for the next one. So I would strongly recommend that if you went out and looked at all the comments that we receive, you'd immediately think, I've got to be there. And it's free, so why not? You can sign up on our website, powerscore.com/free seminars. And there were some other things that we talked about in that crystal ball as well. Heavy instance of pointed issue and principal questions. We didn't think there were going to be any outliers domestically. There was internationally, but to us, that's such a small group that it really doesn't, that's not what we're predicting in the crystal ball. So I think we kind of really got the focus in a broad sense right on the money, and a lot of the student feedback that we got that talked about this confirmed that.
Yeah, we've been largely successful with these, but I actually, in the grand pantheon of our predictive histories, I think this is actually one of the most successful ones that I've seen, not just in terms of predicting the test, but even in terms of like, hey, be aware of this type of circular game. And sure enough, internationally it appeared, hey, we think these are the tests you're going to see, so these are the trends you need to focus on, and the problem sets are built to those. And sure enough, I mean, 2 of them actually appeared. So yeah, again, we could sit here and self-congratulate all day. I'm happy to move on. But I do feel really good about what we were able to accomplish here. And I know that I feel good because it helped people.
Yeah, so do I. And I remind people that when we make predictions, we're talking about non-disclosed tests because that's what they use. So we're not telling them to go grab that test and look at it. You can't. But we certainly know what those tests are modeled like, and we understand what the content is, and we can direct people to similar content. That is the goal. I'd also remind people that this isn't something that we've done for 20 years. You know, it's not like the crystal ball is just this thing we do every single time. We started it a few years back because you and I were doing some test analysis, and based upon some schedule additions that LSAC had made and what I perceived as a lack of possible test reuse candidates, we made the conclusion that it was highly likely that there was one test that was most likely to be used for an upcoming exam. And that's how we hatched this idea. We're like, well, if we think this is the case and we think there's like a 75% chance it'll be reused, let's tell everybody. And that's how this was actually born. It was born out of very special circumstances. And it's continued on because LSAC is in an extraordinary period right now where they don't have a lot of options. They got so many tests and not that many candidates to reuse. And when you are bereft of choice, all of a sudden you become far more predictable, and they've become predictable. Won't last forever, and when it stops, we'll stop doing these. But right now, we're still able to predict it. And I say, again, it's astonishing to me that we've reached a point in the life cycle of the LSAT where you and I could, in any sense, predict any part of it. We should never be able to predict which test would be reused. It's absolutely terrible on one hand and amazing on the other. So we'll continue to do it, and to get it right again, this is like the 7th or 8th time now that we've either predicted in part or perfectly. It's pretty cool. It's just, it won't last forever, but it's cool while it's going on.
Yeah, I think this actually started when they added the July 2019 test at like the 11th hour, if I'm not mistaken here. I think they announced that test in like May or something. We're like, there's not enough time for them to design a new test. What are they going to do instead? I bet they used this, and sure enough. And yeah, we haven't stopped since.
Yeah, and like I said, we'll continue doing it until we don't feel we can go any longer. So enjoy it while it's happening. It's kind of like Britney Spears' career. Enjoy it while she's at her peak, but once she's not, then she's gone. So that day is coming. John, let's get to the Matrix.
Let's do this.
All right, we're going to do this in 2 parts. The first part is I'm going to run through the matrix itself, and then John's going to break down some summaries for the various test scalings that we have. John, does that work for you?
Yeah. Again, you're doing the heavy lifting, so I'm good with it.
Am I? I think maybe you are. So as we look at the scale matrix, same thing I said about the international test. We are focused solely on how many questions you can miss to get a 170. Our baseline starting point, based upon analysis of history as well as release scales, is -7. So if just out of the blue, we would say you could miss on average 7 questions to get a 170, and then we're now going to adjust those scalings for individual test takers based upon the real scored sections that they actually had. And as I mentioned earlier, we typically go conservative. So that's what we were talking about before with kind of like the differences in logic games for the international test takers is if we get the choice of kind of looser or more conservative, we take more conservative because that yields happy surprises on test day, not unhappy surprises. So start off everybody at -7. We'll begin with logic games. If you had the logic games about witnesses testifying, planting crops, cabinet styles, and the duet performances, that was kind of a reuse of July 20. That is a good thing for your scale. Was probably a hard section though, so that's the offset here. That's going to loosen your test from 7 to 8. On the other hand, if you had the bridge repairs, debate teams, lawyer specialties, and work shift games on Friday and Saturday, that is not going to have an effect on your scaling. You would stay at -7. So right now, everybody's either -7 or -8. Let's move on to reading comprehension. First one is the hardest one: Kafka, Big Bang, water pollutants, and UN diplomats. If you had that, you can loosen your scale one more. So everybody either went from 7 to 8 or from 8 to 9. All right. If you had the rent control, assemblage art, courtroom seating, and the kind of like the grass adaptations, that is not going to move your scale. That is going to stay at 0 for you. So you make no adjustment if that was your set. If you had the jury selection, the choreographer, the folk psychology, and the gymnastics, bad news for those of you who thought it was hard, that is not going to move your needle at all. It's going to stay at 0. So right now, you've got some people who are at 7, some people who are at 8, and some people who are at 9. And those are all the number of questions you could miss to get a 170. So if you're online later on and you're like, why do they keep talking about -8 for a 170? That's what this relates to. And then finally, logical reasoning isn't going to move it for anybody. So whatever you've arrived at after logic games and reading comprehension, that is it. Both of the LR sets have no effect. They neither loosen it, tighten it. They have 0 impact. They are 0 on that. So that means the way to do this is, again, start at -7 and then listen for your section. This was my logic games. Oh, I had the bridge repairs and the debate team and the lawyer specialty. All right, you're still at -7. And then if you add something to that, like the rent control, assemblage, courtroom seating, that's also 0. You stay at -7. And then your LR from that test doesn't have an impact. So you would be a -7 scale to get a 170. John?
Nicely done. Nicely done.
Appreciate it.
I stand by what I said, that you had the heavy lifting here. I'll re-emphasize or reiterate the fact that we do try to lean conservative on these. So a -7, you have to use your best judgment. It's possible if you had 3 sections that we just described as not moving it, and you're like, all 3 of those are harder than what I'm used to. Use your judgment. It could have been a -8. But I don't think anything here is going to get to like a -10 level. Nor do I think anything here was straightforward or easy enough that it would have dropped it down to like a -6.
Yeah, and remember the negativity bias that creeps in after the real thing. The actual pressure of performance, the frustrations of ProctorU. Just realize that that's coloring your perceptions for almost every single person. So one of the things that we often get asked is, well, that's great if you're scoring at 170. Not all of us are scoring at 170. How does that affect us as we move through the scale to 165, 160, and 155? And John is your friend for this.
Yeah, how do these things trickle down as we get beneath the 170? And since we've actually arrived at 3 possible outcomes, let me take all 3 and give you 3 different lower level scoring results that I think would be accurate here. So if you are one of the -7 people right now, probably not feeling great, but let me tell you what a 165, a 160, and a 155 would look like for this particular combinations of sections that Dave just gave you for a -7. A 165, you're likely to be able to miss 12 questions there. So depending on your total count, 63 or 64 correct questions for 165. For 160, you can miss 18. So 57 or 58 correct, again, depending on how many you saw in LR. And for a 155, you could miss 27 questions, 48 or 49 correct for 155. And again, that is with a collection of the sections that he just described as not moving the needle at all. If you heard your sections just described by Dave and ended up in a -8 result for a 170, your results for a 165, you can likely miss 13 questions. So again, 62 to 63 correct, gives you a little bit extra there. 160, you can miss 19 questions, 56 or 57 correct needed for 160. And for a 155, for that collection, you could miss 28, 47 or 48. That's all pretty straightforward. Let's look at the final outcome. If you had the game section with witnesses testifying, planting crops and cabinets, and the reading comp section with Kafka and the Big Bang, you would have just gotten yourself to a -9 for 170. That's the hardest and only combination of sections that we think could have gotten there. A 165 for that test form you could miss 14. So 61, 62 correct. But the scale is going to loosen even more when you get down into the mid-ranges. A 160, you can miss 21. 54 to 55 correct. And for a 155, you can miss 30 questions. So 45 or 46 correct, again, depending on your LR total. So that -9 affects the 170, but again, you feel the reverberations of that all the way down into the middle ranges as well.
Excellent. So I think that actually covers all possible outcomes that we would have. And you can see that there's double-digit test forms floating around in here. And now it gets difficult, I think, harder than it is at the 170 level to predict anything lower into the 165, 160, 155, using that same mountain range analogy we used before. But that'll give you a pretty good rough estimate of where you might be in those situations. And so that wraps up the prediction matrix portion of this. And I'll make one note. I actually got a message from LSAC while we were recording this. And the final test taker count number for this exam is lower than even what we were thinking before. It's 15,500. So for those of you who are thinking to yourselves, I'm applying this fall to law school, there's not as many of your fellow applicants as there would have been last year. As John pointed out, last year the June test had 23,000 people.
Well, put a different way, last year's June test was 50% larger than this year's June test.
Mm-hmm.
Oof.
That is small. Now we'll see
what
happens.
If there are admissions people listening to this, I hope they too have drinks.
They're like, what's this dirty Shirley he's drinking? I'm going to have 5 right now. So smaller test crew. We just got that. That is a live breaking update right in the middle of the conversation. And one thing I'll remind everybody is, again, we're going to see that score release coming out down the line here in a couple of weeks.
8 weeks.
So just get ready for that. The exact date on that, John, is Wednesday, June 29th at 9 a.m. Eastern Time.
2 weeks from right now.
Yeah, so a couple of weeks, we'll obviously be out and about talking to people on that particular day, something to be aware of. And the last request I will make, the same as I made in the middle after the international discussion, is we kindly request that you do not summarize this discussion online. It's not that long of a podcast. We put timestamps on it so people can go right to it and hear what we have to say about it. The summaries miss the nuance. They dumb it down to a level that I don't really appreciate, and we want to hear people. We want to give people the opportunity to hear what we're saying about it directly. So if you can refrain from that, that would be super awesome. We'd appreciate that. Any last words, John?
Only that I know we probably made some enemies with the Matrix, but I hope we made some friends with the reading comp. The one reading comp section that seemed to just destroy everyone with some uncertainty was that one about the Big Bang Theory. That, again, being able to, or not Big Bang Theory, but the simulation of astrophysics. To be able to tell people
Machiavelli's the prince.
Yeah, that's experimental now.
That did not count. That's the good news. Spread the word.
I hope that made some people's Thursdays.
Happy to evangelize that particular point. So, on that particular note, if you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you may find it in the world. If you've enjoyed it, please leave us a comment or rating as well. And if you have any questions about anything we've talked about, or just any burning questions about the LSAT or law school admissions, please send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com, and we'll address those hopefully on a future episode. On behalf of John and myself, we hope this was good news for everybody. We hope everybody destroyed and crushed this test. We'll certainly be around in the next couple of weeks to talk to you about it. So in the meantime, stay safe out there, and we'll talk to you soon.